Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we begin with Part 1, Introduction and a Digest of Plato's account of the Atlantean Empire. From Atlantis, an Interpretation by Manly P. Hall. Atlantis, an Interpretation, revised edition with supplementary notes and bibliography by Manly P. Hall. Introduction. The most famous of all accounts describing the condition of Atlantis and the causes for its destruction are to be found in the Critias and Timaeus of Plato. Most modern books dealing with the problem of Atlantis are built upon Plato's description. The integrity and learning of this great philosopher cannot easily be assailed. Had it not been for the weight of Plato's authority, the whole subject would have been discredited by modern archaeologists. There is, however, in fairness to both sides of the controversy, a certain weakness in Plato's story. The thoughtful reader is impressed immediately by the allegorical and symbolical parts of the account. While these do not detract from the possibility that an Atlantic continent actually existed, they do present the necessary elements for an alternative interpretation. The anti-Atlantists contend that in the Critias, Plato takes a flight into fiction. In the words of Plutarch, manuring the little seed of the Atlantis myth, which Solon had discovered in the Egyptian temples. A digest of Plato's account of the Atlantean Empire. According to tradition, Solon was given to the writing of poetry and had intended to preserve the Atlantic story in the form of a great epic. But the responsibilities of statecraft pressing in upon the aged man forced him to abandon his purpose. Solon told the story to his intimate friend Dropis, who in turn recited it to his son Critias. In his 90th year, Critias communicated the account to his grandson of the same name, who later became a disciple of Socrates. It is in this way that the account descended, to be incorporated finally in the Platonic dialogues as part of a conversation between the younger Critias and his master Socrates. Solon, visiting Egypt, was nobly received by the priests of Sais. At his request, the Egyptians recited for him the ancient history of the Greek states. Their narration included an account of an expedition against the Hellenes, attempted by the princes of Atlantis. The Timaeus contains the following summary. In this Atlantic island, a combination of kings was formed, who with mighty and wonderful power subdued the whole island, together with many other islands and part of the continent. And besides this, subjected to their domination all Libya as far as Egypt, and Europe as far as the Tyrrhene Sea. And when they were collected in a powerful league, they endeavored to enslave all our regions and yours, and besides this, all those places situated within the mouth of the Atlantic Sea. But in succeeding time, prodigious earthquakes and deluges taking place and bringing with them desolation in the space of one day and night, all the warlike race of the Atlanteans was at once merged under the earth, and the Atlantic island itself being absorbed in the sea, entirely disappeared. And hence the sea at present is innavigable, arising from the gradually impeding mud which the subsiding island produced. And this, O Socrates, is the sum of what the elder Critias repeated from the narration of Solon. A fuller account is contained in the Critias. In this dialogue, the younger Critias enlarges the description which he received when but 10 years of age from his grandfather. In ancient times, the gods were allotted several parts of the earth, each receiving a part proper to himself and accomplishing the distribution by righteous and proper means. The various divinities established their races and civilizations and ruled over them with wisdom and virtue. But through the ages, numerous catastrophes destroyed these ancient civilizations until only traditions remained. Vague memories of ancient splendors and the divine order of life under which all men dwelt together in peace. Poseidon, god of the seas and the whole humid distribution of nature, received for his lot the island continent of Atlantis, which was greater in size than all of Libya and Asia. At that time, the Atlantic lands were inhabited by primitive creatures, men born from the earth who abode in a crude and barbarous condition. In the central mountainous part of the Atlantic island dwelt Evenor, his wife Leucippe, and an only daughter whose name in the language of the Greeks was Cleito. After the death of her mother and father, Poseidon, seeing Cleito alone and unprotected, became enamored of her. Taking the form of a mortal being, the god Poseidon changed the form of the land about a central hill on which Cleito dwelt. He made alternate zones of sea and land encircling each other. 2 were of land and 3 were of water. and each of the zones was equidistant every way and as perfect as though turned upon a lathe. He then caused 2 springs of water to come up from under the earth, one warm and the other cold, to make fertile the central island. He devised every variety of food, and he caused it to spring up abundantly from the earth so that the island with its mountain became an earthly paradise entirely protected by the great zones which he had fashioned about it. From Plato, the god Poseidon begat 5 pairs of men-children. He divided the island of Atlantis into 10 portions and gave each of them an allotment. To the firstborn of the eldest pair he bestowed the central island containing the dwelling of Plato and made him king over all the others. To the other 9 he gave great territories and rulership over many men, and he made them princes and their sons after them. The 5 pairs of children received their names in this order: Atlas, Eumelus, Amberes, Evaemen, Meneceus, Autochthon, Eleusippus, Mestor, Azaeus, Diapripa. It is to be understood that these are the Grecian forms of the original names. Solon declared that the Egyptians had taken the Atlantean names and adapted them to the language of their own country. He, in turn, had taken the Egyptian names and had Grecianized them. This is stated positively in the dialogue. Atlas had a numerous and noble family. His oldest son inherited the kingdom. Thus, generation after generation, the family prospered, and the empire of Atlantis gained so greatly in wealth that never before or again were such riches assembled. They took minerals and metals from the earth. They domesticated animals and distilled fruits and flowers. There was an abundance of wood, and gold so abounded that they used it to decorate their buildings. With the passing of generations, bridges were built across the zone of land and sea, and a great canal was dug, uniting the outer zone with the central island. Palaces and temples were built until the great city of Atlantis surpassed all empires in dignity and glory. A great maritime trade was developed, and wonders were brought from every corner of the earth. Around the island and its zones, they built great protective walls and fortifications, and they plated these walls with brass and with tin and with a strange red metal called orichalcum. The central island became a veritable acropolis. In the middle was the holy temple dedicated to Plato and Poseidon on the very ground where her humble dwelling once stood. This temple was inaccessible and was surrounded by an enclosure of gold. Here had begun the race of the 10 princes, and here annually were brought the 10 portions of sacrifice. Proximate to this temple was another dedicated to Poseidon alone, of great height and having a sort of barbaric splendor. The pinnacles were of gold, the roofs of silver, and the interior of the dome was of ivory. In the midst of this temple was placed a great golden statue of the god himself in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses and surrounded by 100 nereids riding upon dolphins. In a circle about this temple were statues of the first 10 kings and their wives, and many altars for offerings. Following this description is a detailed account of the palace and its greatness, the houses for servants and retainers, the palaces of titled persons, the stadium, the docks and harbors, and all that forms part of a great metropolis. And the dialogue then describes the terrain of the central island. It was precipitous on the side toward the sea, but further inland there was a great level plain of oblong shape, surrounded by mountains with many rivers and lakes. The plain was cultivated by a race of agriculturists who dwelt there. Great irrigation canals watered the land, and so temperate was the climate that crops were gathered twice yearly. The citizens of Atlantis were assigned to communities according to their estates and positions. Each community had its leader, and all were under the government of the 10 kings, who were absolute monarchs. The kings in turn obeyed the laws of Poseidon, which had been inscribed by the first men on a column of precious substance which stood in the midst of the island. The most important of the laws were as follows: they should not take up arms against one another. All should come to the rescue if any attempt were made to overthrow a royal house. They were to deliberate in common about war and other matters, giving supremacy to the family of Atlas. The king was not to have the power of life and death over any of his kinsmen unless he had the consent of the majority of the 10 kings. Such was the vast power which the god Poseidon had set up in the island of Atlantis. Such, likewise, was the strength which the Atlanteans attempted to use for conquest of the world. For many generations, the Atlanteans dwelt together, practicing gentleness and wisdom and despising everything but virtue. They were neither intoxicated by luxury nor did wealth deprive them of their self-control. They saw clearly that their wealth increased as a result of friendship, one with another. So the Atlantean continent flourished for many ages until at last the divine portion within the people began to fade away. Their souls became diluted with a mortal admixture and human nature gained ascendancy. They became unseemly and lost the fairest of their precious gifts. It was thus that the spirit of conquest came to them. They resolved to increase their lands by violence and by force. Avarice increased, and they no longer had eye to see the true happiness. Zeus, the god of gods who rules with law and is able to perceive all things from his central throne, beholding this once honorable race in a most wretched state, resolved to chastise it. To this end, he collected all of the gods into his most holy habitation from which he could see all that partook of generation. And when Zeus had called the gods into conference, he spoke thus: "Here ends Plato's story of Atlantis." Unfortunately, the words of Zeus remain unknown to us. It appears that the Atlanteans in their pride offended their Olympian father. He hurled his thunderbolts against their continent, shaking it with earthquakes and destroying it with horrible combustion. Thus passed the kingdom before the deluge, and because the catastrophe was so great and so large a part of the civilized earth was destroyed, no records remained except tradition and the two columns set up at Sais. In this way passed the splendor of the old world, and Atlantis became a myth. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.